Adaptations, the Gaseous exchange. I don't know if that even recorded all of my voice then. It probably didn't. I probably cut off halfway through. Anyways, as I said, Adaptations, the Gaseous exchange. This is for A-level WJC exam board, which is basically the same thing as EduCast. I'm just going to be running through the booklet, really. So, first of all, you need to know problems associated with an increase in size. Because organisms need to, exchange substances with their environment, like, oxygen or carbon dioxide. If you're a plant, you photosynthesize. All living organisms do. They need energy, so they all respire. So because they need gas exchanges by diffusion, at the rate of diffusion that can be affected by the surface area, diffusion distance, which is just the thickness of what it's diffusing through, the concentration gradient, temperature of the environment or organism, and the size of the particles that are being diffused. The problem with that is because the requirements of an organism are proportional to the volume of them. The bigger it is, the more oxygen it needs. When organisms gets bigger, usually the rate of diffusion decreases because the rate of diffusion is proportional to the surface area of the exchange surface. So if you compare, say, a worm to a person. Oh, that's a really thick worm. You have a worm, you have a person. Or in this case, I suppose, a gingerbread blob man. This human, most of its surface area is comparatively smaller to the volume of it compared to that worm. The worm has a larger surface area compared to the rest of its body, which means this is going to easily get oxygen and other gases through its, into it. But the person is going to have more difficulty, but unfortunately, because the person is bigger, unlike the diagram suggests, they will need more gases. So that's why you have specialized membranes. Not specialized, specialized respiratory membranes and systems. This theory you would just call it the surface area to volume ratio, because this has a lower surface area to volume ratio. This is a higher surface area to volume ratio, which is better for the worm than it is for the human, So basically, unicellular organisms, like say an amoeba, this is a little amoeba, have the surface area to volume ratio that is large enough for diffusion to occur at the right amount for its needs. But as organisms increase in size, it's more difficult to supply material fast enough because as the size increases, the ratio of surface area to volume decreases. The distances for diffusion increase, and you have a higher metabolic rate, which means you have an higher oxygen demand because you need more energy to maintain the body that you have. So in order to achieve the maximum rate of diffusion, a respiratory surface will need to be thin, because if it's thicker, the oxygen needs to travel further, carbon dioxide needs to travel further, but there's a smaller distance in a thinner membrane. It needs to be permeable, because you want your gases to be able to diffuse easily. If they're not even getting in, then you can't really do anything, can you? It's not really going to have much diffusion happening there. And if it's moist, then they can dissolve in the water, and it diffuses rapidly. You need a large enough surface area relative to the volume of the organism, so that the rate of gas exchange satisfies the need of the organism. And larger animals like humans, have ventilation systems and transport systems to maintain the steep diffusion gradient across the respiratory surface by bringing oxygen or removing carbon dioxide rapidly. So, for the people who have it easy, for the unicellular organisms, you need to know about amoeba, as I've mentioned before. They are very, very, very small, and cell membranes are very small. The cell membrane of an amoeba is a gas exchange surface, because it's small enough to not actually need any sort of specialized surface. It is just its cell membrane. As a matter of fact, this is about 0.1 micrometers. Is that? Sorry, that's millimeters. Micrometers would be that. That is millimeters. That's about 0.1 millimeters in width. So it has a large surface area to volume ratio because, you know, it's sort of flat and small and thin. And because it's thin, the cell membrane is thin, so diffusion is rapid in the cell. Diffusion distances inside the cell are short, and the cell membrane is moist because they live in water, so the diffusion is very rapid. So they don't really need any sort of specialized systems for it, because they can absorb oxygen across their membrane fast enough to meet their needs of respiration, as well as remove carbon dioxide fast enough to prevent building up a high concentration and making the cytoplasm too acidic for enzymes to function. Now, multicellular animals, you know about flatworms, which are just worms that are flat. They have a bit of a weird shape, it seems. They're strange, you know? Some sort of weird arrowhead. They look kind of like that. This is your little flatworm. It's very, very happy because it has a flattened shape. And the reason why that flattened shape is making it so very, very joyous is because it increases the surface area to volume ratio, which means no part of his body is far from the surface, diffusion pathways are short, and that means the gas exchange surface can be its thin skin. So that's why it's so very pleased with its situation. You know, if you compare it to a normal worm, bit of a longer diffusion pathway than this. Surface area to volume ratio is greater in this bit than that one. Yeah, so flat organism, better than spherical. It's a bit more ideal of a situation, although you do need to know about earthworms, which are spherical. Terrestrial organism, which means it lives on the ground, and it's developed a cylindrical shape, like that, and its surface area to volume is smaller than flatworms, but, you know, larger than that of a compact organism of the same volume. If it was just like a circle, if the organism was a sphere, it wouldn't be as effective as a cylinder. This still has a higher surface area to volume ratio, so it still has a larger surface area to volume ratio than compact organisms of the same volume, like, I don't know, maybe a slug. Slugs are a little bit thicker, aren't they? Or like an insect, maybe. Yeah. The skin of the worm is the respiratory surface. It keeps it moist by secreting mucus, and that is why it's restricted to damp environments like soil, because it needs a moist surface of skin. If it's dry, then it just shrivels. It just gets dry. It can't really do so much breathing then, can it? Yeah. Because it's slow moving and has a slow metabolic rate, doesn't need much oxygen, so it's okay that it's not too flat, because it doesn't really need much oxygen anyway. It's very, very slow moving and little. And yeah, there's basically capillaries beneath the skin surface containing hemoglobin, which is what carries the oxygen around the blood cells, and carrying the oxygen away from the surface maintains a diffusion gradient at the respiratory surface. And carbon dioxide is, you know, carried away from the blood and diffused out to the skin, down a diffusion gradient. like, well, yeah, like most things, and larger multicellular animals, such as insects, fish, mammals, higher metabolic rate. So, you know, they need more energy, and they therefore have to have more oxygen being removed, taken in, absorbed, and more carbon dioxide being removed from the respiring cells. So that is why they need specialized tissues and organs, so that they can make gas exchange more efficient, so that they can, you know, compensate for their increased oxygen demand. So that's why fish have gills. I don't really need to write this down, but fish have gills, by the way. Birds, reptiles, mammals have lungs. Wow. And terrestrial insects have something you may not have heard before, unless you probably already know this topic. I doubt you're learning just from me. I wouldn't recommend that. Learn in your lessons, and then listen to somebody else talk. Not necessarily me, there might be better videos out there, probably are. But you know. They have tracheae, which we'll get to later. So each of these mechanisms means they have ventilation to supply the respiratory surface with a fresh supply of oxygen and help maintain the diffusion gradient. You also need to know that ventilation is defined as the movement of respiratory medium, which is air or water, over the respiratory surface, which is alveoli or gill plates. Ventilation is not the same thing as respiration. Respiration is the, you know, oxygen and carbon dioxide are actually moving around the place and being used to produce energy, or glucose. And ventilation is just the movement of the air or water along the area that would be absorbing the gases from that medium. Yeah, so multicellular organisms need ventilation mechanism, internal transport system, respiratory pigment in their blood, and a gas exchange surface that is internal to prevent it from getting dry. Fish. Now fish are pretty good. I have to say I do enjoy the fish part of this thing. It's quite fun. So basically, in cartilaginous fish, like sharks, they have a skeleton made of entirely cartilage, and they have 5 gill pouches which open at gill slits. And within sharks and other cartilaginous fish, the blood travels through the gill capillaries, or I call them cagillaries because it's funny and easy to remember, but you know, the gill capillaries, they travel through the gill capillaries in the same direction as the seawater, which is called parallel flow. So you have the seawater there. I'll do these in different colours, you know. I'll be funky and different. I'll get my little highlighters out. Seawater, blood. So you have your seawater moving in one direction. I'll just do this in pink. Have your blood. Oh, wait now. You have blood moving in the same direction. Parallel. And the flowing, so it's just parallel flow. Now that is quite inefficient. It's limiting it the blood's oxygen concentration to 50% of its possible maximum value, because, you know, as you move along, the gases are being exchanged between the blood and the water. So by the time you're like here, it's already sort of at equilibrium. So there's no more diffusion happening. It's not like you have constantly oxygen moving one direction. You don't have constant oxygen. The water doesn't have a constant percentage of oxygen in it. It doesn't have the highest amount of oxygen in it. and the blood doesn't always have the highest amount of carbon dioxide in it. So it's not always rapidly being moved away, so it's only 50% of the oxygen that you really get, because you just continue along, and then it's already at equilibrium halfway through. So there's nothing else for it to be happening at all. However, in bony fish, they have countercurrent flow. So where you'd have the blood moving in that direction, in the capillaries, or the gill capillaries if you were to be specific about it, the water's moving in the opposite direction, which means there's always the highest amount of oxygen there and the highest amount of carbon dioxide there, which means there's always diffusion happening. It doesn't reach equilibrium, so it's a much higher percentage of its possible maximum value. Yeah, and also you need to know that in bony fish there are 4 pairs of gills in the pharynx, each supported by a gill arch, and along each gill are many thin gill filaments, which are the gas exchange surfaces, which are the gill plates or the lamellae. Sorry, I said that wrong. On the gill filaments are the gas exchange surfaces. The gill filaments aren't the gas exchange surfaces, but they have the gas exchange surfaces on them, which are the gill plates. Yeah, so basically you have your gill arch here, and there's 4 of these, because there's 4 gills in the pharynx, and then they have blood vessels running in them. Move that up a bit. So if I were to do a bit better diagram, I can just use a diagram in the book. So you can see you have, this is the gill arch, there's 4 of them here. You have the blood vessels. These are the gill filaments that run off of them. Loads of them. And on those, you have these gill plates, or lamellae, which those are the gas exchange surfaces. And that is where the water, that's where the water goes through. Between the lamellae. Very, very little high surface area, because they're all so little. Yeah. So you just need to remember the countercurrent flow, difference between countercurrent flow and parallel flow. So this would be countercurrent. And that's parallel. Countercurrent is obviously more effective. It allows the gills of bony fish to remove about 80% of the oxygen from the water, which is actually 3 times the rate of reaction of oxygen from the air in human lungs. So, yeah. It's just for us. We need better lungs. We need gills. But yeah, the countercurrent system maintains a diffusion gradient along the whole length of the gill plate, which would be these. So the whole length of that, the same diffusion gradient is maintained. You can have, if you look, this is a little graph to give you an example. I've made the colours confusing because the water is in pink and the blood is in blue, but as you see, as the distance along the gill plate increases, the concentration of oxygen in the blood increases, in the water decreases, but at some point it hits equilibrium and there's no overall net movement. But with fish that have the countercurrent system, the concentration of oxygen as you move along the gill plate in the blood, they're both going down. It's a bit difficult to read, but because there's I think these should be going the other way around. Ignore that. But yeah, they're just basically, you just need to know the diffusion gradient is maintained along the whole length of the gill plate. The way they ventilate it, the mouth opens, the upper column closes, which would be this. This is the upper column. It closes. The floor of the mouth is lowered, which increases the volume inside the mouth cavity. Pressure of the cavity inside pressure inside the cavity decreases, water flows in as the external pressure is higher than the pressure in the mouth, which moves it over the gills. And then the opposite, the mouth closes, the upper column opens, the floor of the mouth goes up, the volume decreases, so the pressure inside the cavity increases and the water flows out. Yeah, that's the ventilation. I believe they have to be swimming to be able to... Oh no, that's sharks. I think sharks have to keep swimming to do that. Now these are just general ones. You need to know terrestrial vertebrates. They have internal lungs to minimize the loss of water. Their main problem is just water evaporates from their body surface, resulting in dehydration, so they need thin permeable gas exchange surfaces with a large surface area, but they also need them to be not losing water from them, because they need a large surface area, but they need to also tackle dehydration, so they have internal lungs. Yeah. Amphibians, their skin is the gas exchange surface, and also their lungs as well. So when inactive, the skin alone acts as the surface of gaseous exchange with either water or air. Because the skin is moist and permeable and has a well-developed capillary network, it's quite efficient for gas exchange. And the lungs are simple, just elastic sacs with a good blood supply. No diaphragm or rib cage, and the lungs are just inflated by forcing air into them by moving them to the floor of the mouth. And yeah, when active, the lungs the respiratory surface, but obviously if they're not active, they don't really need so much oxygen because they're not requiring so much energy. In reptiles, they're a bit better suited to life on land than amphibians, which is why they don't really go in water so much. Although crocodiles do sort of live around water, but amphibians are really in damp places. They like their dampness. So do lizards. Either way, they have forelimbs without the trunk of the belly touching the ground. I'm not sure why that's really necessary for you to know, but just so you know. And they also have pairs of ribs that project from the vertebrae, which support and they support and protect the organs in the body cavity, and they're also involved in the ventilation of the lungs, because ribs help ventilate lungs because of their intercostal muscles. The lungs also more complex than the ones in amphibians, like frogs, because they have complex internal structure, and yeah, so they have ingrowth of tissues increasing the surface area for gas exchange. And birds, well, they need a lot of energy because they fly, so they have very efficient ventilation. So they have a system of air sacs, which function as bellows, and ventilation of the lungs is brought about by the movement of the ribs, and during flight, the flight muscles ventilate the lungs. So that's quite useful, isn't it? Now you need to know about the human respiratory system as well, because biology, they like you knowing things about people. So first of all, you need to know about the epiglottis, which is just a little leaf-shaped flap of cartilage and connective tissue. It covers the top of the larynx during swallowing, prevents food from entering the trachea. So that would be this little flap here. If you swallow something, it closes this area so that it can enter down the esophagus instead of the trachea, which you don't want it to enter because then you'll choke on it. The trachea, tube that carries air from the back of the mouth to the bronchi, has C-shaped rings of cartilage, like this. Oh, not like that. It's a little bit further around, like this. And that is just to allow food to move through the... Well, usually you'll see that the esophagus is quite small, but it stretches, and that's why it's this the rings of cartilage around the trachea are C-shaped so that it can stretch to accommodate the food during peristalsis. And yeah, it also has a bunch of ciliated epithelial cells and goblet cells. Goblet cells secrete mucus, which traps dust and bacteria, and then the cilia, which are on the ciliated epithelial cells, sweep all the mucus up to be swallowed, or coughed out, I suppose, if you really want to try to do that. Usually you just swallow it though. Bronchioles are small first you need the bronchus, which is just tubes that carry air from the trachea to the smaller branches of the bronchioles. They also have rings of cartilage in their walls to hold them open. Also have ciliated epithelial cells interspersed with goblet cells for the same reason. Bronchioles, very little small air passages. If you see here, yeah, trachea, bronchus, which bronchi and bronchioles. Ooh. They also have ciliated epithelial cells interspersed with goblet cells. Their walls are smooth muscle and elastic fibers, which means they can, the smooth muscles allow bronchioles to widen during exercise, so you have more airflow, and the elastic fibers assist in recoil of the bronchioles during expiration, so it just snaps back shut, so then the air gets forced out much quicker. And then it goes on to the alveoli, which are just hollow lobed air sacs at the end of the bronchioles, which are the gas exchange surface. They have about 90 square meters within all of them, on average, and the walls are moist, because they need to be, 1 cell thick, so that they're, short diffusion pathway, and they're made of flattened squamous epithelial cells. Collagen and elastic fibers are also present, which allow the alveoli to expand and recoil during breathing. And on the outside is a dense network of blood capillaries originating from the pulmonary artery, and that just means all that blood will help the oxygen be taken away from the gas exchange surface, and all the carbon dioxide will be moving out of the blood really quickly. So it's faster paced, what is it called? Respiration. You also have the pleural membranes, which are 2 transparent membranes, and they line the walls of the thorax and the diaphragm. The inner membrane covers the lungs. They secrete pleural fluid, which fills the space between them and lubricates the movement of the lungs, reduces the friction. So that would be around in this little area, so it doesn't get all friction. So the pleural membranes would be this. So then the liquid would be there, because that's in the pleural cavity. Yeah. You have intercostal muscles, which, bring about the movement of the rib cage, causes change in volume and pressure of the thoracic cavity, causing ventilation. So intercostal muscles changes, and the diaphragm, circular radial muscle fibers, it alters the volume and pressure of the thoracic cavity, it's called ventilation of the lungs, and then the ribs just protect the heart and lungs, and are the point of attachment for the intercostal muscles to assist ventilation. And you need to know how these systems work together, just in terms of the movements. So inspiration, the intercostal muscles contract, which means that the ribs are pulled upwards and out, and the diaphragm muscles contract, which just, when they're relaxed, they're that shape. Move this back a bit. When they're relaxed, they're that shape. When they're contracting, they go flat, which increases the volume yet again. So that means that the pressure inside the thoracic cavity, or the thorax, you can say, if you want to be short about it, if you want to say it in a shorter way, increases the volume of the thorax, reduction of pressure in the lungs, and then the atmospheric pressure is greater outside than it is in the lungs, so air moves in via diffusion. And then the opposite happens for expiration. Gas exchange in alveoli, you need to know there's loads of them. So there's a really big gas exchange surface, only one cell thick, so short diffusion path. Capillary walls are also one cell thick and have a short diffusion pathway, and they're all around the alveoli, because it's extensive capillary network which maintains the diffusion gradients, because blood is always taking oxygen away and returning with carbon dioxide. And to prevent the alveoli from collapsing when breathing out, you have surfactant, which is an anti-sticking chemical, and it's made of moist secretions containing phospholipid and protein, very fancy. Low surface tension, preventing the alveoli collapsing during exhalation and when air pressure inside them is low. Also allows gases to dissolve before they diffuse in or out, which increases the rate of diffusion, because if something's moist, surfaces help with diffusion. So you have layer of water surfactant, epithelium of alveolus, and endothelium capillary. Very short diffusion pathway, and the layer of water surfactant helps everything work properly. And then the final thing you need to know really is just the gas exchange of insects. As you know, water evaporates from their body surfaces, which risks dehydration, so they need an efficient gas exchange surface that is, thin and moist and permeable. But obviously, if you have a really large surface area to your gas exchange surface, which they also need because of their body, it conflicts with the need to conserve water. So to reduce water loss, they have evolved an exoskeleton, which is rigid and has a thin waxy layer of a thick layer of chitin and protein. Impermeable, which is good. Yeah, because they have a relatively small surface area to volume ratio, they can't really use their body surface to exchange gases by diffusion, so they need a specialized system, which occurs through, the gas exchange occurs through paired holes called spiracles, running along the side of the body. Spiracles lead to a system of branched chitin-lined air tubes called tracheae, which are these, which branch into smaller tracheoles. Wow, it's sort of like bronchi and bronchioles. And the spiracles can open and close, allowing gas exchange to take place and water loss to be reduced. Also, hairs covering spiracles in some insects contribute to water loss prevention and stop solid particles from getting in. And because the spiracles go to the tracheoles, or the tracheae, which go to the tracheoles, which are here, they go straight to the muscle. It's not just to the bloodstream and then to the muscle, straight to the muscle, so you immediately get oxygen, which is really efficient, actually. And during during flight, similar to birds, the movement of the abdomen causes volume changes within the tracheal tubes, which then ventilates the tracheae. And the ends of tracheoles are fluid-filled and lie within muscle fibers, as I said. The interface where the tracheole meets the muscle fibers is where gas exchange takes place. So right here, that's a gas exchange surface. So oxygen dissolves in the fluid and diffuses directly into muscle cells, so no blood circulation or respiratory pigment is needed. And carbon dioxide diffuses the reverse process. And because most insects fly, a lot of insects fly, requires lots of energy, and so they need a good supply of oxygen. So that's the advantage of the tracheal system, because it rapidly delivers oxygen directly to the cells where it's needed, directly into the muscle. But unfortunately, that limits the size that insects can retain, because obviously if they're larger, you won't really be able to have this system. You'd have to have a specialized system like in birds or us humans. I assume you're a human watching this, unless you're a dog, or a robot, or an alien. All are welcome to learn about the joys of the gas exchange in insects. Yeah, they just briefly mention, the atmosphere used to have more oxygen, so that's why insects used to be bigger. But nowadays, they're limited. And that is it. That's most of everything. That's adaptations for gas exchange. Book 1 animals.